Welcome back to Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. This one is entitled Lancing the Lancer. What does that mean? Well, of course, we're going to find out. This has to do with the very first car that the wife had when she first started driving. So we're dating this back to the late 1990s. The car was a 1985 Dodge Lancer with the 2.2 liter Turbo 1 engine. It put out a whopping 146 horsepower. That was a considerable amount for the time, considering especially what the non-turbo version did. This thing was not in great shape, mechanically or electrically or anything else. It was not in great shape. Originally, the outside of it still looked pretty good, but the paint was really wearing thin in places, and when you'd wax it by hand, you'd take paint off with it. So it was pretty thin, we'll put it that way. The car itself was decked out in pure 1980s goodness. Everything that could be computerized and digital was computerized and digital. This had the digital dash, where the speedometer and the tachometer and everything there was a vacuum fluorescent display that came up, and you had the thing that went across for your tachometer, and the speed just had numbers, and the numbers would increase as you would drive. It was kind of hard to get used to looking at that, seeing these numbers like constantly changing instead of a needle just coming up pointing to the speed like we're all mainly used to. It was definitely a change. It was supposed to be like the wave of the future. It had a lot of futuristic things that we kind of take for granted in cars today, like your fuel mileage, stuff like that. It had a trip meter built in where it could calculate based on the speed of your driving how long it might take to get there and your estimated time of arrival. That was actually a separate module that was mounted below the radio, and that also had a clock on it, and I saved that part from there when the car was ultimately junked, and still have it today set up. Had a video on that many years ago called The Dodge Clock. It has now had things added to it, and I had a whole series on that. There's what do you call those things? Links down in the prescription, so you can watch those videos if you haven't seen them. And if you haven't seen them, oh, took too much skin off. Anyways, futuristic car, plagued with problems because Chrysler and 1980s. They were not doing that well. They still made some pretty cushy cars, and this car was black leather interior, and it was still pretty nice. It ran like a pile of shit. Absolute pile of shit. You would start it up, and I'll give a demonstration of this in a bit. But one thing that I wanted to mention early on was how I sort of, I don't know how to get into this, so we'll just sort of get into it. The wife and I, if you were not aware, were high school sweethearts. After high school ended, we did not give each other phone numbers, but rather we gave each other email addresses because we had them. And we would email and back and forth like that. So for a time, that's the only way we really communicated in the early days. Um, the the way I sort of rekindled my friendship with her, I don't know how to really say it, just because we would see each other in school every day. But then after that, not so much. She had a summer job, I had a summer job, and we were out of high school at that point, so with career and college and all that kind of stuff, they were all getting into. At the time, she worked at the town pool. I had gone there with my uncle and cousin because they wanted to go. And it happened to be by me in my town, and we all went. And there she was. So I spent a lot of time talking to her, and not my cousin and my uncle, and just kind of hung around there. And then when somebody she'd work with would come by, I just sort of disappear for a bit, you know, that kind of thing. So we talked and whatever, and I decided that I would surprise her one day. So I went. It so happened that I had a client I was doing some work for, computer work for at the time, and I stopped there on the way home, and I saw her car in the parking lot, and I went in, and she wasn't there. Now, you can go to the bathroom, I mean, that happens, but she was nowhere to be found, but yet her car was there. I said, this is really odd. And I forget, somehow, like, we crossed paths and didn't even notice or something. And I said, all right, I guess this wasn't going to work out today. And I come back, and there she is in her car, and it won't start. It won't start because it was a bad starter. The starter went bad. Now, that can happen on any car. That's not a Chrysler specific thing, of course. It just, they go. So it went. And I didn't know much of anything about this car. I was there, and I actually met her dad for the first time back when he was still with us. Met her dad there because he came and tried to jump start it. Nobody knew at the time the starter was bad. Well, anyway, he replaced the starter, but it so turns out that the new starter was defective. It was defective in such a way that it would crank extremely slowly. It was probably a rebuilt type job, and it was not tested properly or whatever. It did start the engine, but not like it should. The way it went was this. You turn the key on, the dash lights up, everything's there, and you turn the key to start it, and it would go shoo, whoa, 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 and then it would finally start, and it was like that slow, literally, and it would finally start. So the engine starts running, and it's going like it couldn't idle without misfiring. It was misfiring, and this is how it ran. This is how it ran. Okay, this wasn't like it just happened after the starter. This is just how this thing ran. It was bad. It would get up and go. In fact, one time I remember we got on it pretty good, and it revved all the way out first gear and went to shift, and the whole fucking car went haywire. And there was a light on the dashboard that I think had to do with the turbocharger, and it said power loss. And it had nothing to do with electrical power, engine power. So the computers were really taken over, and this thing was, there was no check engine light to speak of or anything like that. Oh God. This slow starter got worse over time. it got worse and worse and worse and worse, to the point where, as the wife and I were seeing each other more often, and we would sometimes take her car, we once took a drive out to Hauppauge, New York. Hauppauge is Hauppauge. We took a ride out there just to do it. There's nothing out there to see, but we just went out there, and we stopped the car, and we got out of the car, and we took a little walk, and we came back to the car, and we kind of knew that it wasn't going to start. And that is exactly what happened. We are now stuck 40 miles from home, and it won't start. And there's nobody around to try to get a jump start, if even that would have helped. It so turns out that after waiting about 10 minutes, I tried it again, and it just barely came to life. And it would run. It wouldn't stall. It would run. But then we were finally able to make it home. Another thing that happened on that car at one point, really before I was around much, was the vehicle speed sensor went out. And it would fail in one of two ways. It would fail wildly, where you're just driving along in a nice steady 30, and it's saying 80, 30, 20, 60, 40, 80, and it's just jumping all around. And none of those speeds were correct. Or sometimes it would just go to 0. And it would just sit there at 0, and even though you're just driving along at 30, it's... So, that there's other stories where there was another time it broke down, the whiff was in it. I don't remember what the story was with that. This all culminates in the end, of course. There were electrical problems with this car. Every door had a reflector and a light in it. It was common for the time. So this way, if you're on a street, parked on the side of the street, and you open your door, there would be a light and a reflector, so an oncoming car would see that you have your door open and wouldn't take the fucking door off. So that was a thing for a while. Every door had a light, and that there were other lights to light up the floor under the dash, light up the floor in the back. There were lights everywhere in this car. It looked really good, but apparently one time the lights wouldn't shut off, so her dad pulled all of these light bulbs out of the car. I had at one point put them back in and said, no, I think there was just something stupid that either you didn't have the door closed or something, and that's what killed the battery that time. I don't think it really was any sort of problem, and it never was. The battery never went dead with those lights in there. So I don't know what the deal was with that, but it kind of looked cool like that. Being that it was the Chrysler 2.2 four-cylinder engine, it was, like all of them, practically all of them, there are just a few shining examples that this didn't happen to because they were properly maintained. It was an oil burner. Blew smoke out the tailpipe constantly. Constantly. Well, anyway, the trying to remember, the AC. The AC in that car worked, but it was very temperamental. The reason why is the wires that came out of the AC compressor under the hood were like a paperclip. They were bent too many times, and they broke. And now you're stuck with the little couple strands of wire that were still left. Her dad would try to solder these wires back together, and it would work for a week, and then the wires would break off again, and that was that. My dad actually got involved, and he found that those were molded into he called it a phenolic that's a thing, a phenolic molding, and he was able to like carve out some of that and expose more wire and get a good connection between the wires, solder it, and then he gooped it up with something to hold it, and the AC continued to work. It was still short-lived because the car was short-lived. So there's the car sitting there, idling, and the blue smoke coming out the tailpipe, and the AC would work, and you could drive around. You could drive around with your digital dash from the 1980s in beautiful vacuum fluorescent, and yeah, that was the thing. It's a nice car for the time, not quality-wise, but the futuristic type look. So that was the AC and more of the electrical problems. And then one day, finally, we were out, the Whiff and I were out, and we went to this place called Rita's Italian Ice. It is on the border of our town that we used to live in and the next town. It's like 2 blocks into the next town. All right, we go there, puts the car in park, goes to reach for the key, and had this thought that if I shut it off, it's not going to restart. At the same moment, and nobody said anything, at the same moment, I had the exact same thought. But naturally, you turn the key off thinking, that's bullshit, there's no real reason why. Well, that was the reason. That was it. Oh, one time the ignition jammed up. It had a lever you would have to press to remove the key, and you could get it to a point where you could just sneak the key out, but it wasn't right. It just, you had to really play with it. It was a total nuisance. So I went in there and I oiled the entire mechanism, and it worked like brand fucking new. That's all that was wrong with it. So I fixed that on it. Anyway, we're at Rita's Italian Ices, and they're still around. That location is closed, I think. But anyways, that was a fun place. We used to meet up there all the time. It was at a time where life wasn't in the way for a lot of us, so Joe, another friend, Tom, Brian, you could just call people. Hey, going to Rita's. You want to go? Yeah, I'll meet you there. Okay, see you in a few minutes. And you get there, and we sit in the parking lot and wait, and people would just show up because we're all right there. It was a fun time. So anyway, we went there, and we shut the car off. It wouldn't start. Ended up leaving the car there overnight because it was already late, like 8:30, 9. And the owner was cool about it and said, as long as you get the car out of here by noon tomorrow, no problem, you can leave it here. So he was cool with it. That was nice. And it got towed back to her parents' house, and her dad replaced the starter once again. She was supposed to come over to my house, my parents' house, and she said, I'll be over at 3, and 3 o'clock came and went, and 3:30, and I called her, and it so turns out that she said, my car blew up. Sorry? What does that mean? I turned the key, and a puff of smoke came out from under the hood. Okay. My dad's working on it right now. Okay. So, I drove over there to see if I could be of any help. There was a puff of smoke that came out from under this hood, and it had nothing to do with internal combustion. That was wiring. an entire wiring harness turned to, as her dad called it, and I'll never forget this, it turned to sizzling. Sizzling was a bacon product or fakin type product. I don't remember. There were commercials about it and that you can look for. It was a bacon product that didn't have as much fat or something. And the slogan was, don't sizzle fat, sizzle lean. So he said the wires turned to sizzling because they kind of got all crinkly and shit. So what happened was her dad replaced the starter. Car was in the driveway. He started it. It started fine. He put it back on the street where it sits. And 15-20 minutes later, she was going to go to me, turn the key, puff of smoke. So what happened was, her dad replaced the starter but did not notice that the wire going to the solenoid on the starter had a little nick in the insulation. And when she turned that key, that wire became energized and shorted directly to ground and tried to engage the starter. Chrysler, in their infinite wisdom, ran the main power wire for the starter that draws that current and makes the lights in the car dim when it actually cranks over. Because there's 3 wires that go to a starter. Really 2, but 3 if you count ground. When you turn the key, it sends power to the solenoid wire, engages the solenoid. That sends the Bendix drive gear out to engage with the flywheel, and then the car starts cranking. So when you first turn the key, if you listen really, really keenly, there's usually some sort of clunk or shunk or something very, very first. Right the instant you turn the key, that's that getting engaged. As soon as that comes out and meshes, it throws a heavy, heavy switch within the starter itself to draw power from that big wire. And this wire burnt up because it was shorted to ground. Something happened bad. There were, I think, about 15 wires and a section about this long. Every single wire was like burned. And it was not savable in the sense that the insulation had burned so bad that they were all just like bare wires. Her dad sat there for maybe another day, and this actually worked, and it would have worked. We were this close. He didn't pay attention when trying to get a little more slack out of this harness, so he started unplugging connectors. He got the slack he needed, and now he was there with whatever wire he had on hand and reconnecting the blue wire with red wire, because that's what he had. Reconnecting the green wire with red wire, because that's what he had. And, you know, and they were like 15, 20. You would never have this kind of amount of colors of wires and stripes and all kinds of crazy shit like that. So everything was wire nutted at each end, and it was a mess. But in the end, you turn the key, and instead of getting that shong, wah, wah, it just went you know, and run like a bag of shit. Well, anyway, it's fixed, and we now, at that point, had learned that the original starter was bad, and that's why it cranks so slow. So, due to a small oversight, this entire thing burned up, the wiring harness burned up. We're not even into the cusp of this yet. The car is fixed. It starts properly now. Everything's good. We go and take it into that same next town where Rita's was, but I don't know, half a mile more in. We were going to go to a restaurant there. We didn't make it to the restaurant. The car started overheating. And we pulled off into a parking lot. I said, well, listen, this shouldn't, I mean, there's too much bad shit happening at once. I don't know why it's overheating now, but we'll get this taken care of. But right now, the engine is too hot. We have to pull over and let this thing cool off. The place we were going to eat was about 4 more blocks, so we parked the car there, shut it off, left it, and went and had dinner. We came back to the car, raced it back to my dad's house before it overheated, because he was closer to there, and the coolant had boiled over because it overheated. So we added some water to the radiator, had to let it cool some there because it was already overheating by then. And then sometime later got it back to her parents' house, and there it sat. And her dad looked at it and found that the radiator fan, the electric radiator fan, was not turning on. We didn't know why at the time. It was working, but now it wasn't. And I said, well, you know, what we can do is we can wire the fan to always run when the key is turned on, but going to need a relay for that. And I got in the car with him, and we went to the local Radio Shack and bought a relay. This relay that they sold was a SPST, single pole, single throw relay. It had a normally open contact that was closed when the relay got power, which was exactly what we needed. And we ran a new line from the battery to the relay, to the common terminal, and to the normally open terminal connected to the power of the fan. And that way, when you would turn the key on, because the power wire for the relay was connected to something that was powered when the key was turned on, the fan would run. I also added a switch inside the car so that could be shut off, but you would have to mind the temperature gauge. To run the fan would be a little bit of a waste of gas for the electricity that the alternator would have to produce, minimal as such, but also in the winter you kind of don't want that running unless it absolutely needs to. So you would generally leave it on but shut it off. Anyways, long and short of it was, it ran for about 3 more weeks with that always on fan, and then it stopped charging. The alternator took a shit. So this isn't a matter of like a month and a half that this is going on. All this shit. It was like one thing after another. The alternator was bad. Her dad goes, gets a new alternator, or a rebuilt one, or I don't know, puts it on, and we hook a meter up, and that alternator is not charging. Until you would rev the engine up, at which point it would start charging, but the way where it was mounted was close to the radiator, and I have never seen this before. Sparks would jump through the air from the alternator to the radiator. When you would rev the engine up, sparks would fucking jump off the alternator to the radiator to get a complete circuit. We tried a lot of different stuff, and between the radiator fan and the wires burning up in the shit, we had started this engine, shut the engine off, started the engine, shut the engine off, started the engine, shut the engine off, maybe 30 more times than it normally would have in that time span. And that was the final nail of the coffin, because when we finally got this thing to run with an alternator that worked without jumping sparks or something, I don't remember what happened with that. Every time you would start it, the driveway, which was like part of the backyard, would be filled with blue smoke. There was so much smoke that was coming out of the tailpipe at that point that it was pretty much done for. I have a feeling the very, 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 and I'm talking very minor overheating incident blew the head gasket. But it was blue smoke, oil smoke, not really white smoke that you would get when coolant was mixing with the oil. So it was a very, very, very odd phenomenon. And her dad finally decided, you know what? That's it for this car. We're going to have to get you another car. This thing's done. To me, that was sort of a sigh of relief, because it never ran right. I think plugs were put in it and it ran a little better, but it was still, there was something like majorly fucking wrong with this thing. Mechanically, it was a nightmare. Electrically, it was a nightmare. Inside, pretty fucking spiffy. But that's about all it had going for it. Oh, funny thing, my friend Brian said, when I said, oh yeah, she has an 85 Dodge Lancer. He said, Dodge Lancer? I only see those in shops. Boy, was he right. Wow, that was really something. That car was a rolling pile of shit. Cool for its time, but other than that, I don't know, I'll stick to my speak and spell. That's about it. Anyway, that's all I have on this one. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the replacement for the Lancer. So, effectively, the title of Lancing the Lancer, if you had a physical lance and you could lance the car and kill it, that's what we did. We killed off that car in terms of its being taken out of service. So we lanced the Lancer, and then she got something else. And what that will be, you will find out in the next episode of Old War Stories with Uncle Jay. So I thank you very kindly for watching this episode of You Already Know What This Is. Oh, incidentally, that relay that we got at Radio Shack made an appearance years later in a device that I made. Geez, I forget what I even called the video, but there's going to be a link in the prescription. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I really appreciate it. Make sure you click like, make sure you click subscribe, and take care. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.